Okay, in this video we're going to look at JavaScript timeouts. They allow you to have a bit of delay occur before running a function. Okay, so we've learned about JavaScript functions. You can create a function with the keyword function, and then after function you have the identifier, and this is going to be foo, and takes no arguments, and it's going to be console.log. And we're just going to log foo. Another way to make a function would be to create a variable, let bar, and that's going to be the name of my function, and set that equal to an anonymous function. Okay? An anonymous function is a function that has no name, but the name is assumed based on the variable name. Okay? So these are two equally valid ways of creating functions. Notice, if you use the function keyword, there is no semicolon at the end. If you create a variable and use an assignment statement, this entire thing, including all of the text that may go in here, this whole thing is one single assignment statement, and assignment statements have a semicolon at the end. So you're creating a variable and assigning it a value of an anonymous function. So you'll see anonymous functions a lot in JavaScript. They're called, they're known as what's called first-class citizens, meaning they can be stored in variables and passed around as arguments very easily. Okay, so you see anonymous functions all the time, and it's actually quite a nice way to code. So anyway, here's two simple functions. We can run, let's see, bar. We need to go ahead and implement something here. We can say console.log bar. Okay, so we can instantiate these two functions. We can say foo, requires no arguments, and we can say bar, also requires no arguments. And I can run this. I can say node timeout foo and bar. There we go. And what if I want some time to go by and then I want to execute one of these functions? Okay, that's where setTimeout comes in. setTimeout. setTimeout is a function that takes a function as an argument. Okay, so I can pass in one of these functions, foo, and then specify how long I want to wait in milliseconds before this function executes. So there are some rules to this. The time, this is not guaranteeing that the function will run in 1,000 milliseconds or 1 second. Okay, it's not guaranteeing that. It is guaranteeing that it will not run before 1,000 milliseconds. Okay, so that's the only guarantee you get with this. It's not guaranteed to execute in 1,000 milliseconds exactly, but it will not execute before. All right, so that's important to know that that's the only guarantee you get. All right, so we can run this code, and what happens is when I call setTimeout, it takes the function and then the time, and it waits the amount of time. And as long as JavaScript has cycles to spare, once this time expires, it will execute this function. Okay, so we can run this with node timeout.js, and we see after about a second, we log that last foo. Okay, and you can change this to 2 or 3 or 4 seconds. So we can run this and try 4 seconds, and same thing happens. It waits for 4 seconds, and as long as there isn't anything else going on preventing it from running this function, it'll run that function foo after 4 seconds. Okay? Now, this also returns a timeout ID, which is a number. So I'm going to console.log the timeout ID. Now I want you to pay attention here because this is a little bit tricky, right? So we have this let timeout ID equal setTimeout. So this function is going to run, and after 4 seconds it's going to run foo. But the code is going to keep executing. So I'm going to still execute console.log timeout ID before my foo function executes again. So we'll see an ID number before that 4 seconds expires. So there's my timeout. All right, and in let's see, in the browser, this is just an integer. Let's check that out real quick, just to make sure. I don't want to give you bad information. So we have let ID equal setTimeout. We have some function we pass in, console.log, yay, and then that's the first argument. So notice you'll see this format a lot in JavaScript where you have a function in line. This is an anonymous function, but it's really the first argument of this other function. So get used to this sort of syntax. It looks kind of messy at first, but it's actually really nice once you get used to it. And then we want to wait 2 seconds for this to execute. Okay, and then console.log ID. And yeah, so we have type of ID is a number. Okay, well, let's find out the type of in Node. So sometimes there are slight differences between Node and JavaScript. So let's see console.log type of timeout ID. Okay, so that's interesting. So in Node, the timeout ID is an object, right? And in the browser, the timeout ID is simply a number. Okay, so that's interesting. I learned something there. That's a distinction. But either way, the ID is important because you can clear the timeout. So let's say you want this thing to run in 4 seconds, or maybe you make it longer. You're making a timer app, right? Timer apps are very common on cell phones, right? You might need to time something. You're boiling an egg, whatever it is, right? So you start the timer, but if they decide to clear it, you don't want the function to run. You don't want this function could be the alarm to go off after the time expires, right? So you don't want that alarm to go off if they clear it. All right, so I want to clear this timeout before it executes. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say clear timeout and pass in that ID, timeout ID. And now we will see that foo will never execute that second time. We execute it up here, then we execute bar, and here we set the timeout, and in 4 seconds it's supposed to execute. JavaScript will run all of this stuff, and by the time it gets here, this will happen very, very quickly, and it will clear this timeout before the 4 seconds has expired. And so we will see the program just end because there will be no outstanding items for JavaScript to be waiting on. Okay, so we run this, and we see it stopped almost immediately. Okay, that's because we cleared the timeout. You do the same thing in the browser. You store the timeout and clear it. So in JavaScript, the timeout ID in the browser is a number, and in Node is this object. Okay, but either way, you still use clear timeout. So the another version of setTimeout is actually called setInterval. And setInterval does a similar thing. We're going to use bar this time. And this is going to run on an interval every 1 second. It's going to run this function. Instead of just running it once, setTimeout says, okay, run this function, but just run it 1 time after this time frame. What this does is run the function and then do it again in this amount of time frame, right? Now the problem here is, as I mentioned, this can get off a little bit. So if I have a bunch of stuff going on with JavaScript, JavaScript is single-threaded, and if I have a for loop that runs like 1 billion times, like I've done in the past, so I have a for loop that runs like 10 billion times or something like that, that's going to constantly process and take the processor speed. So it might wind up taking more than 1 second before this function runs. Okay, so that can be an issue if you don't know that that's what's possible. Okay, so similarly, we have a timeout here, or an ID as well. So this is an interval ID. So let's save that. We have an interval ID. Set that equal to setInterval. And we can run this. And we see bar continuously runs, and it will never stop, right? So this is, in a way, some sort of an infinite loop. So we need to hit Control-C to break the program. And what we might want to try here is make a timeout that will clear this ID. All right. So instead of this foo function, let's make a function like this. Well, I guess we'll leave that because we already have this code to cancel it. So let's make another set timeout down here. We can reuse timeout ID. We already declared it, so we don't need to declare it again. This is going to be set timeout. And I want to pass in an anonymous function. This anonymous function is what gets executed when the time expires. So this is going to be after maybe 6 seconds, we're going to execute this. Okay, and I'm going to say console.log stopping. And then what we're going to do is we're going to clear this interval. So instead of clear timeout, we say clear interval. And that allows us to pass in the interval ID and clear that. Now technically we don't need to assign this to timeout ID because we have no intention of ever stopping the timeout. Right? Up here there was potential. We decided it might be, based on how our program was written, we might want to stop this timeout at some time. If you have no intention of ever needing to stop the timeout, then you don't need to save that data, right? But if you do intend on stopping the timeout for some reason, then you absolutely do have to save that ID, otherwise you cannot stop it. All right, so set timeout, what's going to happen is we set our interval, bar is going to print every 1 second, and then after 6 seconds, we're going to print stopping, and we're going to clear the interval so it stops. Okay, so there you go. That's one way you can use timeouts to add a sort of delay effect to your code. But remember, you have to pass in a function, and it can be an anonymous function like this. This is actually more often than not how you see it written. You create a function, and this function gets called. Now this function should not have any arguments because the function isn't called with any arguments. So you have to make sure you define a function here that has no arguments, and that function will be called after this amount of time. It's not a guarantee if it's exactly that amount of time, but it will not be called before that amount of time. Okay, so that's enough on set timeout and set interval.